Hello, I'm Dr. Jack Audette. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Overlook Medical Center, and I'm pleased today to have actually two panelists. They both wear many hats within our organization. The first is Dr. Robert Rowland. He is our Chief of Infectious Disease, and he is the leader for our infection prevention department here at Overlook. In addition, he wears the hat of being Medical Director for Wound Care at Overlook. And our other panelist today is Dr. Diana Contreras. She serves as the chairperson of obstetrics and gynecology at both Morristown and Overlook Medical Center, and serves as the medical director of the Women's Service Line for Atlantic Health System. So we welcome both of them today. I have two things that I really need to do to get things started today. The first is I'm going to state the obvious, and the second I'm going to do is to provide some background. So to state the obvious, when we're dealing with a pregnant patient, we're not just dealing with one patient. We're dealing with at least two and sometimes more than two. So yes, that is the obvious. But what comes from this is that the mother-to-be really needs to be fully armed with all the facts, because she needs to make a thoughtful decision regarding what she's going to do during her pregnancy. And we need to support her in the decisions that she makes, because these are things that are thought through very carefully. So that's stating the obvious. In terms of the background, it was roughly a year ago when COVID knocked in the doors here and made their way into our community. And at that time, I had several of my colleagues ask me, well, geez, isn't this just like the flu? What's the big deal? And so a year later now, and I think that the somewhat askance glances I gave them when they stated that were probably well earned, because we know that certainly this has certainly been more than the flu. However, I think there's some things that are instructive if we take a look at influenza. And so for that example, I would ask us to look back to 2009 when we had the H1N1 pandemic. And at that time, if you're someone who likes numbers, what we demonstrated is that 5.7% of the mortalities in this country were in pregnant women. And that's recognizing that pregnant women make up around 1%, maybe a little less, of the population. So that's really pretty significant when you think about it. Now, if you're someone who's really not into numbers, but is more into stories, what I could relate to you is at this time I was the chief medical officer at a hospital in the suburbs of Northern Virginia. At that time, we had a Hispanic population in our town that was hesitant to be vaccinated. And during this pandemic, we actually ended up with 3 Latino women who were admitted to our hospital with severe influenza and ended up in our intensive care unit for extended periods of time requiring mechanical ventilation. And the good news is that they all fared well and survived, thrived, and their babies did well. And it was a real heartwarming to the staff when they came back months later and with their healthy infants in tow. But what that really left me with is a everlasting impression that pregnant women do not necessarily do well with these types of infections. It's given me a real healthy respect for this. So we'll contrast this with the current statement we have from the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology regarding this. And so I'm going to refer to my notes here. ACOG recommends that COVID-19 vaccines should not be withheld from pregnant individuals who meet criteria for vaccination based on ACIP recommended priority groups. And the second statement is COVID-19 vaccines should be offered to lactating individuals similar to non-lactating individuals when they meet criteria for receipt of the vaccine based on prioritization groups outlined by the ACIP. So what you have there is what I feel is a somewhat lukewarm recommendation for vaccination from ACOG. And interestingly enough, the World Health Organization actually recommends not giving the vaccines to pregnant women because this group has really not been studied in the clinical trials. So those thoughtful mothers-to-be that I was referring to earlier really are left with a lot of confusion. And that's why I'm very pleased that we're hitting this topic here today so we can again provide the facts. So with that in mind, we are now approximately 1 year into the pandemic, and the question I have for our panelists, both Dr. Rowland and Dr. Contreras, is, we're into it now. What are we seeing, and are there any parallels that you're seeing to what we experienced in 2009 with H1N1?
The parallels that I would suggest exist, it really centers around the fact that pregnant women as a whole have more difficulty with respiratory infection of the lung. And it becomes paramount, hopefully, to make the accurate diagnosis as it relates to what virus may be causing the infection. Women who are pregnant, as they go along with their pregnancy, they develop increasing incidence of changes in their lung physiology, which kind of sets them up for problems as it relates to respiratory infection. The one thing that centers around the immune system is basically there is some theoretical cell-mediated immunity that gets altered by the pregnancy itself, which can be an unfortunate setup for a bad outcome with certain respiratory viruses. In the case that Dr. Odette was speaking about was the H1N1 pandemic of 2009, but we definitely saw a parallel as it related to COVID over this last year.
First of all, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about this really important topic and at times confusing. What we do know is that pregnant women are at risk for any of these viral infections. And so we do know that, as you so clearly told us, that there are several women who, during the previous times, really had very bad outcomes. No pregnant patient wants to be in the hospital on a ventilator. That's never anything a mother wants. They don't want to put their baby at risk for anything. They don't want themselves to be at risk. And so it's really been a telltale of where we would go with any of these, that we really want to keep moms home with their children and healthy so that they can take care of their unborn fetus and the rest of their families. I think what this virus has been like, very similar to previous ones, is it has taken a huge toll on families and has really affected pregnant women in a way that none of us could have accounted for, but are very similar to what has happened in the past. So in many ways, COVID-19 has been very similar to the other virus pandemics that we've experienced.
So at this point, we're going to get a little more granular. We're going to break our conversation down into 3 segments. One will be prenatal, the other will be labor and delivery, and the third one will be postpartum. So we'll get to the Moneyball question right from the get-go. And the question for our panelists is, are pregnant women more susceptible to COVID-19, and do they bear a greater burden in terms of the complications suffered from acquiring COVID-19?
The issue of susceptibility is not necessarily altered by pregnancy, but the issue of how the particular patient handles the virus is altered by pregnancy. So any pregnant women can acquire the virus. Many do quite well, and there are others, many of whom have comorbidities that we all know about in the general population, unfortunately do worse and end up having to seek out medical attention directly related to the respiratory infection itself.
So this is a really interesting paper because it really looked at a time frame when the virus was very present in the community, and this was in the state of Washington, and they looked at pregnant patients and how they did compared to same-aged individuals. And what it showed is that pregnant patients had a 13 times worse outcome than individuals in the same age group, which really makes us worry that in somehow or another pregnant patients have a higher incidence, and one has to wonder why, and is that because women may be more susceptible. We also have to just wonder why and really answer some of these questions over time. But it does leave us all with the feeling and the concern, the data, that pregnant patients have a higher incidence than non-pregnant patients. And I think there was a question that you also asked related to how pregnant patients did. And what we do know from the data as well is that symptomatic patients who have COVID do worse than pregnant patients who don't have COVID. And that has been pretty clearly come out in the literature. And it puts these women, and I may be jumping ahead, so forgive me, Dr. Audette, but it puts these women at risk for a number of different things, and including very much the ventilator issues and potentially death. And it also puts the fetus at risk for having premature birth, which puts the baby at significant issues. So both for mom and for baby, there are concerns when a pregnant mom gets COVID and is symptomatic for it.
Yeah, I found it was interesting in that study, which had 240 patients in it, that the odds are 1 out of 11 of developing a serious infection with COVID, 1 out of 10 of being hospitalized, 1 out of 30 of going into an ICU, 1 of 60 of being placed on a ventilator, and 1 in 80 of actually dying from COVID-19. I thought those were very sobering numbers in comparison to the control group. Dr. Contreras, wonder if we could circle back, if you could talk a little bit more in terms of what the numbers were regarding preterm labor.
I actually, I have to refer back to you, Jack. You seem to have that data right off the tip of your hands. But what I do know is that there are significant increases related to that. We try very hard to prevent patients from delivering early, because we know that the earlier gestations that babies are born at put them at higher risk for more complications. So we try to avoid having babies born early, but unfortunately for COVID, when moms get sick, based on these statistics that you have just shared, there's always the worry that the fetus, the unborn child, may be putting mom at significant ventilatory risk. In other words, she can't breathe as well and might end up on a ventilator. So sometimes the decision is to deliver that baby early. And that's obviously something that we really try not to do unless we have to, because it's really it's really because we want to keep mom alive and doing well. So really it's about they live together and they really affect each other. So to be honest, I don't have that number off the top of my head. I'll defer that to you if you have it. But it's really, we try to avoid early labor as much as possible.
One of the things I've learned in my job is never ask a question that I don't know the answer to. So I do happen to have the numbers, but to be honest with you, in many ways, you provided the story, which is really, I think, the most important aspect of this. But the numbers are pretty astonishing as well. It's 45% preterm labor in women who have severe COVID, compared to 5% in a group where there was perhaps mild COVID or had recovered from it. But this really brings us to, we had the Moneyball question. Actually, this would probably be the even better question, and that would be the suitability of vaccination for COVID for women who are pregnant or are considering pregnancy. And I think we could probably start with Dr. Rowland on this one.
Vaccination for pregnant women is absolutely warranted in this situation. Right now we have 3 vaccines, 2 of which we have a fair amount of experience with over the last several months. One was just released this weekend. Unfortunately, none of them were able to initially include pregnant women in their pool, but have expressed desire to add that over the time that these vaccines continue to be evaluated. Pfizer just actually stating that they're actually enrolling women in a trial that are pregnant to, again, acquire that data. But vaccination in this patient population is absolutely warranted, and at this point, the data would suggest that it has been safe up to this point to administer the vaccine to these patient population.
So this is a hard decision, right? And this is to me, the hardest part of all of this. Pregnant women are always left out of clinical trials, and that's because we don't know what will happen with the fetus. So it's not uncommon, and it's very common that we find that we have to give medications to pregnant women without knowing what will happen. And always when we make those decisions, it's based on a risk-benefit ratio for mom and for the baby. Now in this situation, it's really heartbreaking, right? Because we have no real data. Pregnant women weren't in the trials, so we can't say 100% for sure. But what do we know? We know that the vaccines were given in animal studies, which did not show any bad outcomes to the animals that were born. We also know that somewhere about 10,000 pregnant women have taken the vaccine in this country so far, and we have not seen any adverse outcomes for them. So that's what we do know. It is a very difficult decision for any woman to make, but we also know that is paramount in all of obstetrics, is that when a mom gets sick, that is bad for her baby. We really have to focus on mom and keeping moms well. I think the data at the University of Washington is so strong in telling us that if moms get COVID and get sick from it, they can really have bad outcomes for moms, and bad outcomes for moms affects baby usually in a very bad way. So we really have to focus on mom. What is good for mom? Because things that are good for mom ultimately are good for babies.
So we live in an era of misinformation, fake news as it were. And one of the things that was floating through the internet here several weeks ago was that COVID vaccines affect fertility. Dr. Contreras, could you address this particular issue?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. You know, I want to encourage everybody who's listening. Media and digital media is not where you should get your sources. It's really important that you stick to the right sources. I recommend looking on the American College of OBGYN's website or looking on the Society for Reproductive Medicine's website. What they have found is there's absolutely no evidence to support that the COVID vaccines will cause infertility. So it's very clear that this was based on a false report. Someone made a statement about maybe there could be some cross about something that looked similar to a placental protein. It has not been shown. What the literature has shown, what the data does show, and the studies do show, is that the only patients who had stillborns during all of this were in patients that were in the group that never received the vaccine. So I think it's very clear that this is false, but it's really important that people go to the right source to get their information, because otherwise there's no filter on the internet. Anybody can write anything and say anything. It's really important that you go to the societies who have studied this. The CDC also has a great website that addresses many of these issues and is fact and data-based.
So let's move on to labor and delivery, and this will land squarely with Dr. Contreras. So the first question would be, is there any indication for a cesarean section in a patient who has COVID-19?
When we do a cesarean section, whether it's a patient with COVID-19 or a patient without COVID-19, the indications are still the same. So if mom is in a situation where she can't breathe and it may benefit mom to have the C-section, that's when we might go ahead and do the C-section. Having COVID alone is not a reason for having a C-section.
So this labor and delivery question is for Dr. Rowland, and that would involve the support person, dad, doula, grandparent, who's going to be with mom in the delivery room. So the question would be, can an asymptomatic partner support person attend labor and delivery, and sort of what are the rules that we need to have to protect everyone?
The support person has become a standard part of labor and delivery for many years at this point, and is a critical piece in what should be a very, very happy and joyous occasion, the birth of a child. Jack stated one part that has to be emphasized, is that this person that is coming with the patient is asymptomatic, meaning they have no symptoms of COVID or any respiratory infection at all. That's the first thing. And usually there'll be a series of questions that'll be asked of this particular individual, and also whether they have potentially been exposed to anybody with a confirmed positive test. Therefore, are they inside or outside of the quarantine window that is needed to be adhered to before they could come in with the patient. The main thing, though, then is masking, social distancing, hand hygiene, which are basically the standards of infection prevention, which have been adhered to throughout the COVID pandemic, which is important for not only the healthcare personnel, but for all the people that come in to visit patients, and those that are support personnel or support people for the pregnant patient.
So now we'll conclude with postpartum care, and so we're passing out the chocolate cigars at this point, but in addition to that, is there anything that we should be doing to evaluate the baby and the COVID positive mother? And we'll move this question over to Dr. Rowland.
If the mother is COVID positive, the baby automatically becomes what is termed person under investigation, meaning the child has to be screened, and while that child is being screened, the child is isolated away from other infants that potentially, if that infant would be infected, could potentially transmit it to those other infants. The mother and the baby are not separated. They are allowed to continue to be together, but the main thing is to keep the infant until the testing returns on whether that child has acquired the virus from the mother.
We encourage rooming in here at Overlook Medical Center, and unless the mom is symptomatic, we really don't encourage the mom and the baby to be separated. We encourage moms to stay with their babies and babies to stay with their moms. Further, we even did a study, and there have been studies done that the likelihood of a child getting COVID from a mom who delivers them while they have COVID is almost zero, if not zero. So I want to encourage everyone out there that this is a safe time. We really focus on trying to keep the family together and really making sure that the birth experience, whether you have COVID or not, is really a positive experience, and really encourage everyone to be as optimistic and positive as possible, because we take all the necessary precautions. We screen all the time. We follow all the DOH recommendations that we are encouraged to follow, and we follow them to the letter of the law. And I want to make sure that everybody understands that throughout our entire labor and delivery experience, mother, baby, and postpartum, that we really encourage a family bonding experience, because it is really important that that happens.
Actually, Dr. Contreras anticipated my next question, so thank you very much for that. Next question I would have would be, can breast milk transmit the COVID virus? And we'll go with Dr. Contreras on that one.
So we encourage breastfeeding. What we have seen is that lactation and breastfeeding are very safe, that we do not pass the virus itself, we do pass antibodies. So what we have found, even with babies who are born of moms who are COVID positive, they do pass the antibodies. And what that means is you're protecting your child. So you can protect your child both by offering the child breast milk, and if you had COVID, you're not giving them COVID, you're giving them a protection. So once again, it's mom protecting their baby. So I think it's really important that moms realize that there's a role for that, because they can do what they always want to do, which is protect their child.
So we'd asked earlier about whether pregnant women or women considering pregnancy can have the vaccine. So we'll actually sort of double down, only ask that question in regards to lactating women. And throw this to both of our panelists in terms of, is vaccination safe in lactating women?
Yeah, vaccination should not be withheld from lactating women who are going to breastfeed their child, which, as Dr. Contreras stated, is encouraged for all of the reasons stated, passing on basically antibodies, passive immunity to the child, and allowing that child to become closer with the mother during that early period of time. So absolutely, really should be no restrictions placed upon simply because of breastfeeding.
So over the weekend, Dr. Fauci was making the rounds and telling us all to roll up our sleeves and take whatever vaccine that we can get. But I think it's a little bit different scenario potentially with pregnant women. So we've got 2 messenger RNA vaccines made by Pfizer and Moderna, and now the J&J vaccine, which has come out over the weekend. So we really haven't seen all the data yet regarding that, but that's a viral vector technology associated with that. So it's a little bit different. So I'll throw this question to Dr. Rowland, because he's really been my vaccine expert. Any considerations that we need to consider when dealing with the issue of vaccination of a pregnant patient?
Well, the main thing with the vaccines right now, the ones that we all have more experience with, and when I say a lot of experience, it really only is several months at this point. The Pfizer and Moderna vaccines have several things that are distinct about them. Both require 2 injections. Both require some cold chain and cold storage issues, which must be maintained to maintain efficacy. The new vaccine, which has just been released, the J&J viral vector vaccine, which uses a attenuated adenovirus to deliver the spike protein, whereas the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines use a nanoparticle which holds on to a messenger RNA which encodes for that spike protein. Both basically deliver a similar entity with the same end result, where we develop antibodies to the spike protein. The cold storage issues have made it somewhat of a problem for facilities to maintain. The other thing is the scheduling of the second dose. The most recent vaccine, the J&J product, is a single dose, which is presumed in areas where getting somebody back for that second dose may be difficult. But it really, at this point, the J&J, we don't have enough information really to really say too much, accepting what was been done in their early phase trials. Time will tell as we get more information and we start to introduce that into the population at large.
So we'll wrap things up here. There's really three statements I'd like to make as we're concluding today's presentation. And the first is really a disclaimer that what we've discussed today is what is known as of the date of this filming, which is March 2nd. And things have definitely changed in a very rapid pace during this pandemic. We continue to learn more every day, which I think is a wonderful thing. The second thing I'd like to state is that for those of you who are out there who, in regards to the vaccine, are telling me you're sort of waiting to see what happens, what I would share with you is that here at Overlook, we're into our third month of providing vaccinations, and everyone has done just really well. The sky has not fallen down. Things are going great. Now, here's a rhetorical question. 1 year ago, like I said, COVID knocked in the doors and came into our community. And what was going on 3 months into that? So it's a rhetorical question, but I'll answer it regardless, in that many of the people who worked here had become ill. We even had some of our team members had died. So I think that really should be something you think about if you're sort of that waiting and watching to see. My question would be, what are you waiting for? Would be my question. And then the third thing is really a statement, and that is that if you look at vaccination, this is our best shot, and admittedly, that's a bad pun, but it's our best shot to get out of the trouble that we're in and to get ourselves back to some state of normalcy. And here I'll state, frankly, my personal belief is that although this is a personal choice, at some point we really need to enter into some type of a dialogue, because at some point I think we really need to view this as a societal responsibility, because we all do collectively want to get back to some type of normal state. So I really want to thank our panelists today. What I am going to do is allow them to have the final word, and we're going to start with Dr. Rowland.
The issue of getting vaccinated or not getting vaccinated, I think it's actually clear. The fastest way to herd immunity, which we've all heard about now through many of the newscasts, is through vaccination, not through native disease. The other thing that I think all of us that have been involved with COVID in any capacity has seen is if you acquire COVID, you just don't know which patient you're going to be. With a patient that basically gets nothing, maybe doesn't even really get sick to any real great extent, or doesn't even know they have it, they just get tested for some reason and they find out they're positive. To the individual who becomes sick, gets tested, to the individual who actually ends up in the emergency room door because he or she feels sick enough to be there. And then finally, those that end up in the critical care unit and subsequently requiring mechanical ventilation, some other modalities that we don't really need to talk about here, but just basically to say that critically ill, requiring extensive support, and subsequently passing away because of complications of this disease. You just don't know which patient you're going to be. We know there are comorbidities that make it higher risk. Those again have been well publicized, but plenty of the patients that we've all seen really didn't fit into any of those comorbidities and ended up critically ill despite. So I would encourage those that are seeing this today, if you're on the fence, I would encourage you to seek out vaccination through any of the clinics that are available, through your physician's office, and there are plenty of websites through the New Jersey Department of Health or Atlantic Health System that you can actually find out where you can get scheduled to get your vaccination.
I just want to let everybody know that this decision about getting the vaccine in pregnancy is a difficult decision. We don't have the data, and therefore that leaves pregnant patients in a tough spot. And you may hear from your physician something that you agree with or something you don't agree with. You may hear from your family something you agree with and something you don't agree with. It is a very difficult decision. What I encourage you to do is get the data, understand the data, go to the right websites. Don't just look at any internet website. And really decide for you what's the best thing for you and your baby. And the most important thing that you need to know is that we support you in whatever decision you make, because you are empowered to make the decision to have the vaccine or not have the vaccine. It is very important that you also understand that when moms get sick from COVID, they do worse than moms who don't have COVID. And that affects both the mom and the baby. And it's really important that you understand moms have died from COVID, unfortunately, in this country. So we encourage you that whatever decision you make, we're going to support you, but be informed and empowered to make that decision. So thank you for allowing me to be able to share that with you.
So I'll conclude by, again, thanking our two panelists, two physicians I'm proud to work with as a colleague, and wishing that everyone stays safe out there. We hope that you found this informative and good health. Thank you.